Cool. Ben, do you want to give a mini introduction first, and then I will introduce Nathan?
Fantastic. Yeah, so I guess Claire and I collaborate on the Cambridge Theatre Hackathon, and a sort of question we've been sort of asking in sort of performance practice is, what is digital theatre? What can it do? How do people interpret that? And so we did that last year with our first sort of hackathon that we held at Cambridge. And so this year, before we did another one coming soon, keep your inboxes open for that one. We thought that we'd sort of start asking more wider questions about, like, what is it from a sort of theoretical standpoint, and trying to get some voices and viewpoints in there to try and get some discussions around the idea of what digital theatre is, if there is even such a thing as digital theatre, and a divide between digital and physical theatre. So it's very open, very fluid, and this is our first one of these types of discussions. If anyone watching has any sort of ideas for sort of future panels, future ideas that talk to us about, we're very happy to discuss those sorts of things. I'm sure we'll be able to share details in the future. And yeah, that's pretty much where we are with this. So Nathan, you are our first pancake, as it were, to use a terrible metaphor for that. But we're really excited to have you and Claire.
Yeah, and I think Nathan was a participant in the last hackathon, so can say how chaotic it was, but how much we're looking forward to the next one, I think.
And how very enjoyable it was as well.
Good. Yeah, we're really excited to have Nathan, who I'll do a mini bio, which was mostly from the event page. But yeah, Nathan Whitehouse is a writer, director, and video editor. He studied game design and programming at Hampshire College, and was a co-founder of Dacha Theatre in Seattle in 2016. COVID moved the theater online in 2020, where he created Robot Face with Nick O'Leary to sort of blur the lines between theater and games. I was really lucky. I got to sort of watch Robot Face in real time as a sort of participant audience member, and it was one of the most interesting things that I was able to do during lockdown. I was really glad to sort of witness that firsthand. But yeah, turning it over to Nathan now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for the
just to jump in very unprofessionally straight away, and to say that we've got a chat. Obviously, hopefully we've all done Zoom before, but if you do have any questions, there will be a question and answer sort of discussion panel right at the end. So Nathan will be talking for about 45 minutes, I think, and then we'll open that to questions. But if you have anything as it goes through, any thoughts, any questions, feel free to add them in the chat. Claire and I will sort of collate those and make sure that we ask them if they disappear under all of the many questions that I'm sure you'll have. And now I finally will, Nathan, allow you to speak. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to take a brief second here and bring my presentation up on the screen. And so hopefully you all are seeing a PowerPoint. Wonderful. Okay. So yes, as Claire said, and again, thank you for the introduction. My name is Nathan Whitehouse. I've been doing immersive and interactive theater for just about a decade now, basically since college, most of it with Dacha Theatre, who are based in Seattle, Washington. And so Robot Face was indeed our 2020 pivot show to online. We had a very different plan, and we ended up postponing that show and having basically a call for pitches of what can we do in a short amount of time that is A, online, and B, I suppose this is what Ben was talking about as well, really should be online, right? Not just how do we bring something that we were going to do anyway online, but if we have to be online, let's try to take advantage of what that can actually bring to the table. So I co-created this show along with Nick O'Leary, just to give credit where credit is due. And I'll briefly give you a pitch for what the show actually was. The focus of this talk is mostly going to be kind of a post-mortem on the technical side of things and why we did things the way we did. But I'll be happy to answer questions about the broader show as we get to the end as well. But this is definitely going to be more of like a, here's what we did, here's what we were thinking, here's how it ended up type of presentation. So Robot Face, every single performance of Robot Face represented the first ever episode of a new reality show, The Digital Dialogue. In that show, we had 4 teams of audience members who were each given their own AI chatbot to try and program. They were meant to compete against each other to see who could create the most human AI chatbot in the time allotted. These 4 audience teams were the audience members who were participating in the show most actively. They signed up to be in this role ahead of time. They joined the Zoom call earlier. Actually, they were the only ones who experienced the show on Zoom. Everyone else experienced it on Twitch, which I'll get to later. And they literally were producing the content of the reality show. They were programming their AI chatbots live. We were cutting to the team room, showing what they were doing. We were cutting to the video of the actual chatbots interacting. So they were very much a part of a show, essentially. For your reference, those teams, we tried to keep them to around 4 to 7 people. So that's about the size that each one would be. And obviously, sometimes you had people who came as friends. Sometimes you had people who didn't know each other, all working together in the moment. The actual challenges that we were putting these chatbots through were basic social situations. So the first thing they had to do was make a pitch to why they ought to be on the show. They also had to go on a date. They had to apply for a job. So these were very much like, when I say challenges, I really just mean mundane situations. The rest of the audience watched the show on Twitch, and they had very much their own different experience. We really made sure there was content just for them. There were commercial breaks. There were other subplots. There were opportunities to weigh in on Twitch to help vote for the winners, things like that. But I'm going to mostly be focusing on that participant experience. And I think the last thing that's really important to call out is the fact that the chatbots were not actually chatbots. These were actors who were portraying chatbots. And what we did in designing the show is we created a tool to allow the audience to essentially program these actors as though they were the chatbots. There was a focus on narrative, I'll add. And again, talking about what digital theater could be, we really didn't want this to just be a game, a toy, an interesting experiment. The goal was to produce a piece of theater, something that took us on a bit of a journey. And so, again, I'm mostly going to be talking about these interactive elements, but I do want to note that we definitely wanted there to be more to it. So, talking about chatbots, ChatGPT is a little funny in this day and age because, you know, in 2020, it felt close, but so far away. And now, obviously, it's inescapable, and the discourse and the ethics and the discussions about what role it has and how it's, you know, scraping content that isn't necessarily, permission wasn't given for it to be, you know, scraped and built into these AIs. But at the time, the inspiration was partly that this was just kind of very fun and very strange, right? It felt almost like this weird funhouse mirror reflecting reality. And the fact that it could almost sound like humans and was drawing on things humans had actually said and could sound incredibly cohesive for a moment and then completely fall apart was just this very, to me, it was a very bizarro experience and one that I thought was interesting. And while the actual show and the narrative of the show touched very lightly, I suppose, on AI and, you know, what it could be in its role, that wasn't really the focus of the show. And certainly in hindsight, we didn't go very deep into that at all, given how quickly we've moved on this topic. But I think this is still relevant, partially because the show was never actually meant to be about AI. It was really meant to try to capitalize on that funhouse mirror aspect and sort of reflect on what it means to be human and asking the audience to do that in a way that's also hopefully very fun. If you're trying to program your chatbot to be very human, you have to make decisions about, well, what does it mean to be human? How can I show my humanity in a few moments? Would it, you know, which aspects of the personality do I want to put to the forefront? And will I have the same idea as the other people on my team? And so that was really the point of the experience. So in that sense, AI was really meant to make people think about themselves. So this is a brief excerpt from the pitch you can see up here. Like I said, when we had to pivot really quickly, we threw together several different pitches. And the main focus of this one was essentially, well, a coding language, programming AIs would sound fun. The narrative stuff, the story stuff was also going to come later. But the initial idea is like, this just feels like something you could really do online that you couldn't do in person. I'd love to take a moment to kind of talk about what some of the goals we really walked into the process with. And then hopefully we can reflect on those in the end, how well we did. The very first goal we had, I would say, would be kind of creating a fantasy, right? The fantasy that you are a coder. This is just something that I think is, in general, is extremely fun and immersive in interactive theater. When you give people a role, when you give them a job, and when you give them the tools to successfully act like a professional or someone who knows what they're doing in that role, that's just an inherently enjoyable experience. And so everything we did should have the flavor of coding. You should be able to trick yourself into feeling, wow, this is actually like, I'm a programmer. And so trying to keep that skin on top of everything is very important to us. At the same time, we really wanted to make sure this wasn't a show just for people who knew how to code or targeted at people who found coding interesting. It should really be actually so simple and accessible that anybody could come in and have a good time. We wanted to create sort of an element of mastery, of puzzle solving, right? Because at the end of the day, a coding system is a tool, and you're supposed to use it to create things. And we wanted to make sure there were opportunities for people to come up with something very creative and then be proud and excited when they saw it succeed and showed it off to the other teams. And so that was really partially, well, okay, we have to design our coding system that way. And then also we have to design our challenges and our scenario to allow people to do that. But talking about coding as a tool, I think it's also really important that people could be creative, which is a little different than the puzzle solving angle, because this is where maybe it's not so much about achieving a specific result, but showing your own approach, putting your own personal flair on things. And I think in a show, asking people to be like, think about what it means to be human, well, we're very creative, and that's one of the ways we show our individuality. And so hopefully you can do a lot of different things with this. The very last thing too is I want to say that failing has to be really fun. This is, just an important part of I think any kind of interactive show where you actually want to let people succeed or fail. If you're not doing an escape room, but you're doing something that's not so intense. Failing was going to be frequent. It was going to be fun. And that would make the successes feel even better because they're against the odds. It would mean that everyone's enjoying themselves when they're watching their chatbot put on the screen and strangers are watching it perform. And I think that there's also something very appropriate for a coding themed show as well, because when you write your code and then you execute it, it just goes and it does what you told it. And if you told it to do something very silly, it's just going to go do that. And there's this wonderful moment of dramatic irony that always happens when you're like, oh, I know what's happening and it's my fault and I know why I did it. And in this case too, you're often very powerless to stop it. To give an example, if you have a mode for your AI where maybe it can react to an insult very defensively, and then it reacts defensively to another question that was very polite, and suddenly like, oh no, I know exactly why it did that. And now it's stuck in the angry mode and it's yelling at this very nice person. So that was another area we thought would be fun. I want to touch on two other considerations outside of what we wanted the audience to experience. I'll get into these in more detail later. The first was the AI actor experience, because we didn't have chatbots. We didn't actually have a programming language, right? We just had plain text and human beings. And we really needed to make sure that whatever we built for our tool and our programming language was really easy for our AI actors to make use of, right? Ultimately, it was going to be their scene partner. They were going to have to improvise and act alongside whatever this programming language, whatever this tool was giving to them. And so we needed to make sure it was very easy for them to do that. It's a little outside the scope of this talk, but we also did a lot of research and rehearsal time to try to help the actors figure out how to sound like a computer, sound like they're actually random. Being random is something humans are notoriously bad at, right? If you ask us to generate a random number, it will deeply not be random. And so there was work to be done there. You can see a lovely idle animation that one of our actors had worked on. They had lots of different ways to feel almost like they were really just visualizations. So that was also very important, but I won't go into that quite as much. The last thing I want to mention is the role of our PAs, our programming assistants. We knew pretty much immediately that we couldn't design a tool, at least in this time frame, and honestly, probably in almost any time frame, that would be robust enough for the audience to actually control directly, to put directly into their hands. So we decided basically immediately that we were going to have actors be the ones who interface with the tool. And certainly in digital theater, that also made things very, very much easier for us, because ultimately all the audience needed to do was come into a Zoom room where they could chat with this character who's operating the actual terminal, right? Broadly speaking, I also just feel like whenever you have interactive theater, facilitator characters are just extremely, extremely important. And when you really make them characters in the world, it's just incredible what you can get done, because they're adding to the story, they're bringing people into the world, they're also helping make sure that they succeed, they're moderating discussions, making sure that quiet audience members aren't steamrolled by the people who really, really love their ideas, stuff like that. So just to get a little more specific about our timeline, we had our initial pitch, we had 5 weeks of rehearsal, that included our tech week. We had early frequent play testing starting in week 2. We came in with this pitch, but we really didn't know how it was going to work or what we were going to do with it. And so we knew, okay, we need to be bringing in people frequently and as soon as possible in the process. I'll touch on this a little bit later at the end, but I will certainly say that I think early play testing is insanely important. And I think you are almost never not ready, that people should come in as soon as possible. Frequent play testing is, or frequent early play testing is maybe debatable, because it's easy to get lost in the weeds and be spending time before you've actually developed something to another milestone where it really needs input. So what I'd like to do is show you here on the left an excerpt from the actual finished tool, the Speakeasy. And I'll get into the technical side of it a little more, but this was a web app. Like I said, the programming assistant would be entering things, interfacing with this on their computer, and be streaming the results to the participants in their Zoom room. So I'll try to run through the language that we created really quick, because I think a lot of our design time and iteration time and thinking about this was, well, what should this language look like? And so we ended up coming up with a couple different tools that seemed like they'd be useful for people. The first was this command called extrapolate from. And I think you can see what we were going for with the flavor of coding here, because you've got an underscore, you've got a parentheses, you know, little things like that hopefully make people feel like, oh, wow, this is coding. With a ChatGPT or other predictive text, generative text systems, you start by entering a prompt usually, and then the computer finishes the prompt. Extrapolate from was our way of doing that, exactly that. The audience could write something. In the example that's circled, you see, the name's AI name, and I love to ... And this is saying, hey, the actor is going to keep improvising. The AI is going to keep generating based on your prompt, based on, you know, the tone and the words you chose. I think that's fairly straightforward. We also included a say command, which is just say exactly what's in the parentheses, what's in the quotes here. Do not improvise, do not expand on this. And I think that's worth noting, because it was something that we knew right away wouldn't actually be very useful to people and would lead them down a kind of a tricky path. Like, you really should be using extrapolate from to find success, because that's how you're actually going to have your AI really respond dynamically to things. And it turns out people just really felt like they should be able to do that. And so we made sure to make space for it. And it was really fun, I think, because people kept discovering for themselves why it was not necessarily a great idea, and how as soon as you say the exact same sentence twice in a row, the exact same way, you have shown deeply that you are not human. And so I think that there's something cool there, in that we were maybe preemptively like, well, this is a bad idea. And it turns out that this is a good thing to learn by failing, and was ultimately used, but everyone tried it at first. That's what the AI could say. And that was, I'll honestly just say, you know, looking ahead, that's the only way you could really tell your AI what to do, what to say, was this extrapolate from or this say command. But when should they say it? We decided to go with kind of an if-then statement format. So along the side here where I've circled, you can see you could enter as many of these little if statements as you like. Flavor of coding, you've got these brackets, it's got to be uppercase. Not actually coding, because you can write whatever you want in here. This is going to be parsed by human beings on the other end, right? In this case, if you're asked if you like ice cream, ask for your name, you could put whatever you want in here. The flexibility of that too is important for us, because this is where people could show their creativity, and whatever they could think of, their chatbot could react to it. I also think it was really interesting, because making people be this very discreet and specific about what their AI can respond to was intended to encourage people to think about, well, what does come up in a conversation? Or more importantly, what's important in a conversation? What do I want to spend my limited coding time towards making sure that the AI is ready to respond to? And so I think it kind of did hit those creativity goals as well as those puzzle solving goals. And it was fun even seeing differences in strategy, right? Because there's value in having an if statement that's really vague, because it's probably going to actually fire. There's a million things that could trigger it. Your code's going to get seen. And sometimes there was value in having one that was extremely specific, like ice cream specifically, because it's unlikely to come up. So you might have wasted your time, but also if it does come up, you sound really human. And then that could lead to meta strategies of saying, well, how do we force the conversation to go to where we've actually programmed good responses and capture it, move it along the way. I would also say that this hit our goal of being pretty easy to understand for people who weren't really familiar with coding. I think that pretty quickly, these two things were grasped by just about everybody. That will bring me to one of the more challenging things we added and things that had some mixed success, which was modes. You can see on the top, there's actually different columns, mode 1, mode 2. You could add as many of these as you'd like. And the idea is just, as you can see, a mode is an entirely different set of responses to the same if-then questions. In this case, you have a mode called make a good impression, and you have another mode called defend yourself, which if you look down, I haven't highlighted this part, but you can see it actually gets, there's an activate to code partway down the line. And that's going to say, if you get insulted, now you're going to defend yourself. This was something we thought would be really important early on, because the ability to switch between states and react to things was something that was very human. And the fact that it was so rigid, in the same way that an if-then statement was going to make you think, what's really important about this conversation, what's going to come up. A mode might encourage you to think about, well, what are the different ways in which my character or a person might move through the world, which are the ones we're going to highlight. Modes were a little more complicated in terms of how people actually use them, though. And the big issue with modes is that they take a lot of time to create a mode. And you can also do a lot without using a mode. And so it was a combination of people maybe tunnel visioning on not using modes immediately. They kind of forget they exist. They're just like, okay, and then if this, and then if this, and like building a million item long if-then list. But at the same time, once our PA started reminding people that modes existed, they actually really justified their inclusion, because they allowed you to do things that were just really not possible otherwise. And I think specifically, they really enabled people to actually make something that make their conversations in the challenges have something like a flow, and not just something that responds helpfully to various different questions. But now you can have a story emerge where the AI gets angry, and then it goes into a different mode, and maybe you can reconcile and stuff like that. And also in terms of mistakes being funny, this was an incredible source of hilarity, because if you talk about, for example, there was a group that forgot to have a way to leave the angry mode. And so they had to watch the rest of the conversation. They got flipped into angry mode, and they knew this is the dramatic irony, like, oh, there's no way out. And they didn't realize that. And that was very amusing for them, thankfully, and very amusing for everybody else. And so the other thing that was very fun about them, the actors did lean into switching very immediately from happy to, I keep using angry as an example, but people use them for all over. There's one group that had a mode where the character revealed that they were actually a treasure hunter and the secret was out, and then they could talk to you about the Holy Grail, stuff like that. So people did get really creative with them and had a lot of fun with them. But they were a challenge to get people to engage with. And that, I think, is something I want to come back to a little bit in the reflection. We've got a couple more things I want to talk about, though, because I will say that modes, if, say, and extrapolate from, these are all very much in the moment. They're very much responding to just whatever the prompt or the situation is that is in front of the AI, right? But we needed a way for people to have these characters to have more continuity of a personality, of who they were, of what their vibe was, even just outside of a specific question. You didn't have to keep rewriting like in your prompts to make sure that every answer sounded a certain way. So we came up with this idea of the bank. And you can see up in the corner here, there's just a couple different phrases. I guess this person is a science and technology loving surfer bro, which is certainly a choice. But the idea behind the bank is that these were things that were meant to always be in the actor's mind, the AI's like mind, and they might draw upon it at any time, whether that's saying it literally or just riffing off of it, right, in words that might be similar. And so you would put a couple things in your bank that you hoped would define the personality of your AI. I think this is an interesting one to talk about now, because As I mentioned with the modes, it turns out that there was the time pressure. People learning how to engage with this thing was really intense. And so in some ways, the bank was disappointing because it was really, really, really not powerful. And it was really, really, really random. So if you talk about the goal of, I want to overcome a challenge, I want to feel like I created this AI purposefully, this often led to very random and hilarious results, very successful in other ways in making the show fun. But it was very difficult to give your AI a personality with the tools that we had that was truly consistent. But at the same time, this is dead simple to use. Just put some stuff in there, and the actors were really good about trying to balance, giving the audience kind of what they intended versus what might be a funny or incorrect interpretation of that. And I'll actually get to how they made that decision in the moment a little later in the talk. But ultimately doing something really simple like this, I think, served the show. We certainly couldn't have afforded to give people anything crunchier to work with than just put some phrases in there and we'll have fun with it. Couple other really, really quick things. Set tone, respectful and polite, you can see up there. Just a really quick and easy way to shorthand, like, here's how we want the actor to perform, right? We want them to act this way. Then there's a memory function. So the next thing, I guess I'll go in the order of the circle. So top, you have set tone. Then I've circled this default response converse. There's not much to say there, except that we needed this to really feel like programming, and a machine will only do exactly what you tell it to. And we wanted to make sure that if the audience forgot to program something or missed something, the AI didn't just sit there, or it didn't fail, it didn't say nothing. That the default response was to just converse, which is just riff. And in some ways that might not have been necessary. We could have easily just told people, hey, like, just so you know, if it doesn't know what to say, if there's no code, it just talks. But I think spelling it out here was important for that coding flavor, because look, you can actually see what it does. And if you want, you could change this default response, which I can't remember if that happened very often, but it's certainly a highly chaotic move to do, to actually change that. So it was almost there more for the flavor than utility. And then memory here, you at the bottom circle, there's activate to, and then there's remember, the insult. Memory is a good example of something that really we could have just done without. There was this feeling that we wanted to make sure that people really felt like they had a lot of tools at their disposal and a ladder to climb. And if some people wanted to just stick to if-then statements, like that, they would feel good, they would enjoy the show, we wouldn't like force them. But for the people, maybe the people who come in and they know how to code or something, they like, hey, there's like, you can go deeper and deeper into the system and find more powerful things. And the reality is just, it was almost never used. And when it was used, it almost didn't really have a very large impact. The idea, it's pretty self-explanatory. It just made sure that the AI would actually remember whatever thing you've put in there, so it could reference it later. So if it's riffing off of the, in a conversation, it can remember that you called it, a coward or whatever the insult was, right? Or someone's name was an example that we did see people use a lot as a way to make sure the AI remembered somebody's name. Actually, so that was probably the most common use and one that did help things be more human. But all of this to say, there was a lot of complexity piled on, and we spent a lot of time in our devising and building, thinking about and talking about things that really people that weren't quite as essential. And I'll get back to that in just a minute, because I do have a couple other things I want to point out about the system. But if I were to summarize, we set aside a lot of time to do research, to try things, to experiment. And we wanted to make sure we really found what was fun. And we found some stuff that was really fun really early on, extrapolate from if-then, modes, a little later the bank. But we're like, oh, we have all this time to keep iterating and keep trying things. And we kept going. And I think we wasted a lot of time exploring when we should have said, this core is enough, let's move on to something else. And so I think memory, we had a lot of stuff that didn't make it into the show, and memory is one of the few things that from all that extra experimenting time we did actually ended up in the show, and it turns out not super useful. So quick technical specs about our system. It was developed in JavaScript by Sam Levitich. It took about 50 hours of work over the whole process. I said we started testing 2 weeks in, but we really wanted to make sure we could test right away. So we just drew it up in Google Sheets, and obviously the final form looks a lot like a spreadsheet because that's what we started with. I think I've said most of this, so I'll just keep moving on. Here's a quick screenshot of the actual of a Google Sheet test. You can see it looks very similar. I think that it was really, really awesome making sure we could test right away. And I don't think we would have gotten as far as we did if we weren't able to just say, like, bam, we're running code like right away. Like week 2, everybody's met each other. We've kind of done the casting, built the basic premise of the show. But at the same time, I think a lesson that was very interesting to learn was how much having a final version of the tool really, really changed everything. Because there was a time when we were working on the Google Sheets and we got pretty good at it. And there was a period where we almost felt like, do we even like I guess we're doing this, we're building this tool, but this Google Sheet is like really good. But there were certain additions, quality of life things to the tool that really just changed everything. To name a couple here, there was an autocomplete, so you don't have to type extrapolate from. That's a nightmarish thing to type. More than even one time, it's nightmarish to type. And so being able to type, like, I think it was just EX, and it would immediately autocomplete to, extrapolate from parentheses. Things like that suddenly allowed us to get a lot more done. In this little screenshot that I've pulled, a couple things are highlighted, so you can see that actually it catches that there's an error in your code, or you didn't finish typing something. Some boxes are highlighted purple, which is reminding you, hey, this is where you switch modes. So if you're trying to quickly at a glance be like, yeah, don't we get angry? Don't we go into the angry mode? But where does that happen? You can find that more quickly. And similarly, if you have nothing in a box, it might also highlight red just to remind you, like, did you mean to fill this in? A lot of these things were really for the PAs to help them in this very chaotic moment of like, okay, I'm trying to facilitate a group discussion. I'm trying to type things. We only have 15 minutes to do this challenge, making sure that I'm taking care of everybody and pointing out the loose ends and asking, do we want to put something in this red box? And making sure also that we don't give our AI actors the challenge of having to deal with broken code that shouldn't run. So there were a lot of basically quality of life things, and they were incredibly important, and they really changed the game more than I thought they would. And I think it's also really relevant that these fixes, these changes, were really targeted at the actor playing the programming assistant, because I think that one thing I'm excited to talk about is how the facilitation was far more important than the tool. And I'm talking a lot about the tool because it was important. The fiction of the show required that everything went through the tool. If it didn't go through the tool, you couldn't do it. But it was ultimately calibrating the performance of the PAs, teaching them how to learn the system, use the system, learning from what they were figuring out from being the people who were actually on the ground and playtesting, like learning what people respond to and don't respond to. Ultimately, the facilitation was like 90% of what mattered. And when I talk about how we spent all this time iterating on the programming language in the tool, and some of it was wasted, I think that's partially because you could give people half this, and if your facilitators are really on point, it's amazing what they can actually, how complete, how robust, how exciting they can make it feel. The role of the PA is, as I just said, facilitation was far more important than the tool. There's the audience really interacting with the PA, not with the tool. Just to reiterate that it was an incredible amount of work and just raw rehearsal time and playtesting time for them to get to the level they needed to be at. And so setting aside that time was really helpful. And I think it's always really interesting because when I talked about how we had these quality of life elements to the tool that didn't come in towards the end till the end, but they really changed everything. When you have an audience facilitator in a role like a PA, they learn early on when the show isn't built right and nothing's quite working because you're still figuring it out, and we're using a jury-rigged system, that they really have to drive things forward for anything to happen, because otherwise the tool won't be there for them. The show structure isn't there yet. And then there's a really fascinating process where once the tool is working, you have to kind of collectively work back and say, now you need to stop helping people so much, and we need to actually let them learn and trust the audience and trust the tool. And so I think that's definitely something I've seen in other forms and other processes, and just it was interesting seeing it with this purely digital tool, that it was really their scene partner, right? That's the best way to think about it. And it was having the real tool is the difference between having a scene partner who's reading from their script versus someone who's off book and who can actually pay attention to you. And you can trust that they won't forget their lines, so you can go try something else, right? And so just knowing that shift is going to happen is something I think that was a valuable lesson that I learned. The other thing I'll add about the PAs is because they were so closely in contact with the audience, and these were very high pressure situations. And we got feedback from audience members after the show. Consistently, we heard that a lot of people, one of their favorite things was the relationship they developed with their PA. Every PA had their own side story, their own personal problems, their own character, and that was really important to us. They weren't just yet another cog in the machine, but they were literally a person. We even went a little bit out on a limb and had a PA whose backstory was that they faked their resume and didn't know how to use the system. And the audience was immediately like, yeah, we're going to help you. We're going to figure it out. We don't want you to get caught. And, you know, it was really fun navigating that dynamic. And so, yeah, the fact that these were characters brought the whole thing together. For the interest of time, I might come back to these, but we spent a lot of time codifying the tips and coming up with best practices and working together to figure that out because this was such an important role. But I'd love to jump ahead and talk about run mode on the tool, because near the beginning of this talk, I talked about how, okay, you've got the spectator experience and what you need for them, but we also really need to take care of our AI actors and set them up for success as well. And that can't just be done through practice, right? So what you're seeing here, and I'm going to play a little video here, is what we call run mode in the tool. When the teams were done programming, the audiences would go, the participants would tune back into the stream of the actual reality show, and they would watch the same thing the Twitch audience was watching, and we would interview them and cut to them and do all sorts of like reality show content. And meanwhile, the PA is actually setting up and piloting this system. And during the challenges, this is what the PA is doing. So you can see the code here. You can see my little cursor. If I click on something, the box up there changes. It flashes. So we actually have a couple different areas. Through some OBS wizardry, that flashing box area is the only thing, in the top left, I should say, is the only thing being shown to our AI actors, right? They just see that little top part. The PA is seeing this whole thing. And then there's a little video, there's a box in the upper right, and that's what the spectators at home are seeing. So this is basically answering the question, how did we actually, like, quote unquote, run this code? And the answer is a PA was listening, the same PA who programmed it was listening to the conversation. And whenever they believed an if statement was being triggered, they would click on the phrase and it would beam all the relevant information over to the AI actor. And this was really important that it worked this way, because the AIs, to really behave in an inhuman way, they just had to empty their minds, and they had to be in this space of pure improvisation. And there was no way they were also going to try to follow code and try to evaluate these statements. And the reality is, if someone programmed something and then because of actor error, it doesn't happen, that to me would break the suspension of disbelief more so than any other error we could commit. As soon as an if function that should have fired doesn't fire, you've really let people down. And so we really tried to make sure that the tool helped people along in doing that. So the PAs had a very important job of actually following along. They programmed it, so they also knew what it did. So that gave them a big heads up. In that box up in the top left, you can see, in addition to information you might be familiar with that's being presented to the PA, or excuse me, to the AI, such as what mode am I in? What tone should I have? There's a leftover set accent set field that we stopped using. There's also something called RAND. You can see here it says RAND 2. And we talked about actors having to decide how well to interpret the intentions of the audience versus how off the rails to go. And we decided that in addition to their acting instincts, which they absolutely did follow, as a prompt for them, we would also give them a random number from, I believe it was 1 to 4, or maybe 1 to 5, where 1 would represent you're going to execute this, extrapolate from faithfully to the intention of the message as best as you understand it. And 5 would be you're going to go completely just off the rails. It's going to fall apart. And giving them that prompt really freed them from a burden of having to imagine, like, well, what, it would be very funny if I interpreted this the wrong way, but have I done that too many times? Should I do this? Should I do that? It just gave them an out to just be in the moment. And so that was really, really successful. And I think that the actors were pretty happy with the tool in the end that we came up with, and felt like it was making their job easy to just get in the moment and execute the code. So that's the system. That's a bit of a post-mortem. I'd like to just talk about a couple things we learned. I think some of these I've touched on. And these are a little general, I would say. And some of these might be like, yeah, obviously do this, do that. But there's a certain element when you're doing a post-mortem of like the things you see in hindsight, you're like, yeah, like obviously you should do it correctly instead of incorrectly. But hopefully some of these are still applicable. And as I mentioned before, that first one is that we did find the fun. And I wish we trusted it sooner. We believe we had this assumption coming in that this is something we don't know. We've never done this before. We have no idea what's going to work or not. We really need to set aside a lot of time to test and iterate and try everything because we just don't know. And I don't think that decision was a bad one. But really early on, we kind of hit on a couple of things that were just already kind of fun. And we kind of said, no, we have all this time. We need to keep exploring. Like, this can't be it, you know? And at the end of this period, we almost had exactly what we started with. And we've thrown away a lot of things that we tried. And we spent a lot of time discussing things. And so I think it would be helpful to remember that once you found that fun that you're looking for, you can move on, you can keep going. And an area that this really impacted the show and the show really suffered was that the challenges, the actual conversations that we were making these AIs perform, didn't get as much time as they needed. And so had we realized early on that we were okay on the language, the coding, the tool side, we could have moved that energy over. One specific, I'll highlight two specific ways the challenges were not very good or could have been better. The first is that the actors who were playing the celebrity judges who would ultimately end up leading these conversations with the AI really needed a level of rehearsal time doing that. A much higher level, right? Like we were very intensive with the PAs and the AIs, but like we need to make sure you're really dialed in on what this needs to be. And we were a little more laissez-faire about making sure that there was that same level of rigor. And so those scenes could sometimes be unpredictable, and it took us through the run to really dial them in. But the bigger issue is going way back, one of these big goals was opportunities to show mastery over the system. And because we didn't know what the language is and we kept iterating over it, we weren't able to design challenges that like really made you play to your strengths of like, well, what can this language do? What can extrapolate from do? What could a mode do? They're very much more general. And I think we could have easily made those a lot more unified with the entire experience, rather than we spend a lot of time on the code and threw people into these conversations. This is all to say, as the slide says, that the relationship between the tool and devising was a little less synergistic than we thought. There was this belief that devising can often really lead to these wonderful, I've done a lot of devising, where by doing everything a little bit in tandem, you can be inspired from something that's happening in one area and affect and improve something that's happening in the other area, and you can end up with a very unified system. And so we believe that also by making sure we didn't lock things in too early and keeping things open, there would be this dialogue, but there just wasn't. And I think part of it is because I think there's a lot of reasons. And I actually think that I would love to try to do more devised digital online theater, because this feels like one of those cases where you probably need to approach it differently to make sure that ideas and things are really sparking off of each other and the process is running the same way. And having not done another digital show since this one, I haven't been able to follow up on that, but I think that's an interesting area. Calibrating the tutorial was brutal. So I gave you guys a really quick rundown of all the language concepts. And as you can see, maybe each one individually, I don't think is very complicated, but it's a lot to throw on somebody at once, and a lot to throw on 4 to 7 people who might be strangers at once. And so I think that is a part of the tool we knew would be a problem, and we didn't realize how big of a problem it would be. And it took an incredible amount of work to onboard our audiences in a timely, entertaining fashion. And if I'm being honest, we didn't completely get there by the time the show opened. So just keeping that part of the process in mind. I mentioned this before, it didn't really come together until we had the tool. The fact that it was like a scene partner, the fact that the actors could let go. The only thing I think is new that I'd like to add is that our tool's programmer was actually an actor and improviser himself. And in hindsight, thinking back on the process, I actually think that was really important, because he was able to anticipate and understand the needs of the actors and of the audience, quite frankly. He'd done facilitation work before as a character who did that. And so I think he was already making choices on his own that were going to support us later. And I have to imagine that wouldn't have been so smooth if we were trying to fully have to explain everything, why it needed to be the way it needed to be. Very personal one here. I talked a lot about the time pressure. Each team had 15 minutes to program their AI. And I think it was really easy to be optimistic, unrealistically so, about what people would eventually be able to do in 15 minutes. Early on when you're prototyping, you're in Google Sheets, it's very slow. And you know it's going to get faster with the tool. So you kind of say, oh, well, it'll get faster with the tool. The PAs are still learning. Oh, it'll get faster with the PAs learning. And it did. But I think there was an element of wishful thinking that if I had been able to say, okay, 15 minutes, it's never going to be very long, you could have structured things very differently. And to give a very concrete example, something I've thought about is the fact that our 3 challenges were very different in nature. So first, you're introducing yourself to the game show world, almost like a confessional in a reality show. Then you're applying for a job. And then the third thing you're doing is you're going on a date with one of the celebrity judges. They're all very human conversational situations, but they're all very different social situations. And the fact that we're mostly working from if-then statements meant that you really have to be specific in your if statements about the topics you think are going to come up. And the topics that will come up in a job interview are very different than topics that would come up in a date. And so the optimal strategy often involves throwing away whatever you did for the previous challenge and starting over. And we could have worked on this. I mentioned I wish we'd spent more time iterating on the challenges, less time on the language. That would help here. But I also think part of it is realizing, okay, if people only have 15 minutes and they're not going to get very far, it would be infinitely more satisfying to prioritize a series of challenges where they're always building on what they had before, that they're adding a new component to something. They're watching it get richer and more powerful rather than starting over, which did have its own advantages. It was fun for teams to say, well, let's try something totally different. But I think it would have been a lot more fun if we realized that we could have unified that process a little bit more by realizing how hard it is to throw everything away. Very last thing I want to mention here, people expected more control over the endings. And I think anyone who's done interactive theater has run into this issue, because anytime you let people play with something, they really want to see it have an impact on the world. And often they reasonably should expect it to impact the world. I think it's an interesting takeaway for this show, because in our minds, there weren't supposed to be a lot of control over the endings, right? We gave them a playground of, it's a reality show, it's a competition, there are these other plot lines, but they're more like, we've given you a package of what the show is. It's this reality show, who's going to win. And people still really thought that all these different threads that you kind of hint at as background, they wanted to pull on them. For example, there was a PA who had a crush on someone else in the organization. It was very consistent that people tried to play matchmaker using their AI and really expected something to happen there. And I think that we could have actually, in the time we had, created ways to recognize those changes in the world if we'd realized people were going to be so adamant that they should be able to affect these things, but we just weren't prepared for it. So anyway, that's my postmortem. That's my time on that, I believe, and I'd love to pop out of this and answer any questions you guys might have.